This channel is part of the History Hit network.
In 1830 at Windsor Castle, King George IV makes his regular nocturnal pilgrimage to the Night Stool. His style and tastes once defined an era, but now the former Prince Regent, the first gentleman of Europe, is a 67-year-old invalid and recluse, blind as a beetle, fat as a featherbed, and often woozy from his favourite nightcap. Sweet cherry brandy laced with bitter laudanum. Opium in a handy liquid form. He could, at a pinch, do without the brandy, but not without the opium. It muffles the screaming pain of his gout. The side effects of this addiction, strange dreams, bizarre delusions, and general intellectual disarray, seem a small price to pay. Elsewhere, George's latest and last mistress, Lady Cunningham, bides her time and counts his jewels.
He's only happy when he's ill. I believe he's shamming.
But Lady Cunningham is wrong. It won't be long before the hacks, the obituarists and the memoir writers will have their final say on an unloved prince who became a much-loathed king.
The Times of London will castigate George for his unceasing and unbounded prodigality and for his indifference to the feelings of others. His most celebrated monument will be dismissed as that mountebank pavilion, a cluster of pagodas at Brighton.
Attacked by the same pack of hellhounds.
Spoiled and selfish, according to the politician Sir Charles Greville. An odious beast who only wished to be in power to exercise the most puerile caprices, gratify ridiculous resentments, indulge vulgar prejudices, and mass or squander money.
The injustice and persecution of the world.
George IV, one historian will observe, melted away like a snowman. Only the clothes remained. Sold, by the way, at auction to that venerable institution, Madame Tussaud's Waxwork Museum.
What do you say? Who the devil are you, sir?
The verdict of history, Your Majesty. Echoes from the past, glimpses of the future. Letters, sir. Diaries, memoirs, journals, papers. Life and Times, true accounts. Primary sources, sir. Guaranteed authentic. For the most part. The raw materials of biography, Your Majesty. Your biography. No? Well, just think of me as the consequence of too much laudanum. And leave it at that.
There is much about my early life that I now repent. But as king, I've always tried to benefit my subjects. I have shown mercy to others and hope that it will be shown to me.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial. And Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
Financially incontinent.
Gambling, indolence, massively overweight.
Narrow-mindedness, puerility, frankly.
He's a bigamist.
Enormously self-pitying.
Selfish.
Self-indulgent, womanizing.
Grossly unattractive.
A laughingstock.
Very self-regarding.
It has been said that he invented the art of living, but there is something faintly sort of disgusting about that, isn't there?
He's probably the most unpopular king in Britain for 400 or 500 years.
The Prince Regent was doomed from the start.
The poet William Blake said, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." George Augustus Frederick of the Royal House of Hanover was to follow this road to his dying day. But not in search of wisdom. He was trying to escape his childhood home, the palace of piety. For George, this was a palace unfit for a prince. A fairy tale kingdom without the fairy tale. A fruit pie without a crust.
The court in which George IV was brought up was notoriously one of the dullest in Europe. Horace Walpole famously called it the Palace of Piety. It was dull, it was sober, it was teutonically correct. George III, the king, devised even a home uniform that all the members of the royal family had to wear, even when they weren't on show.
What they were trying to do, I think, was to give a kind of sombre, sober moral tone, an environment in which the children could be trained up, particularly George, all the way right from the beginning. The king and queen are very conscious that he has a particular destiny that he's got to fulfil. And the only way they thought that was going to be achieved was by giving him a kind of internal discipline. He had to learn to regulate himself. George's father, George III, had this very, very elevated idea that kings simply have to be more virtuous than other men. That's why they're put on earth, that's the point of them, that justifies the way that they've been set above others. And therefore, the desire to make his son into a good man has a lot to do with kingship, as well as just wanting him to be good for his own sake.
The Hanoverian royal family does seem to be split into the dull staid people and those who went off the rails. George III was very keen that his son stayed firmly on track. He laid down a very lengthy series of precepts for his son, both intellectual and physical, which involved prescriptions for diet, what he'd eat during the day. Simple soup, simple meat, lots of fruit, and very strict upbringing, and very regimented childhood.
Soup, neither strong nor heavy. Plain meat without fat. Clear gravy and greens. And for dessert, a fruit of tart. Without crust.
earth leaves is a tart without a crust.
George III, remember, he's the man who bred pigs. He planted his own vegetables. He and the Queen worked on their own vegetable patch. This is something they try to inculcate in their children too, particularly their two eldest sons. So there's the future first gentleman of Europe digging away in his parsnip patch. The difference in temperament between young George and George III, I think, was massive. He's someone who loves to eat, but he's not someone who loves to see it grow.
My dear son, my inclination is to grant you all the rational amusement I can, and keep you out of what is improper. Whenever you are desirous of dancing, I shall very readily forward it. But I shall not permit going to balls and assemblies at private houses. When you do not frequent plays or operas, I shall endeavor to make evenings pass agreeably, playing at cards or conversing in the music room. The choice shall always be yours. I wish to live with you as a friend, but by your behavior, you must deserve it.
His behavior towards me was so excessively unkind, there were moments when I could hardly ever put up with it. Sometimes not speaking to me for 3 weeks together, as if I were not there. Speaking to people each side of me, then missing me. And when he did honor me with a word, 'twas merely, "It is very hot," or "very cold." He hated me. Always did. From 7 years old.
I think the Prince Regent was doomed from the start. But when the public first became aware of the heir to the throne, they were very predisposed in his favour. He had good looks, good manners. The old king was in uncertain health and had lost America apart from anything else. And they saw this dazzlingly good-looking boy, who in those days was moderately slim. And it was a breath of fresh air.
He's a very polished character. He can speak fluent German, absolutely fluent in French. He spoke other European languages, tolerable Italian, but he was also quite a good Hebrew scholar as well. He was a very practiced musician. He could play the cello. He could sing very well. He's also very witty. When he's a younger man, before the drink and drugs get to him, he's quite good company. He's sort of a good person to be next to at dinner.
George was felt by a lot of people around him to be a naturally gifted actor. They often remarked on how if he hadn't been king, he could have been a great comic actor. They all remark on his fantastic ability as a mimic. And you can imagine the delight of having dinner with the Prince of Wales, and not only is he telling you stories and jokes, but he's mimicking his father. He's doing impressions of his father and his mother and his uncles and his aunts. He's putting on their weird German accents. That can set the table on a roar in a way that anybody ordinary telling jokes wouldn't.
It was unfortunate that he moved into and helped create a set who really epitomised the less attractive side of the Regency.
George associated himself with all aspects of society, from the aristocratic rakes and political ne'er-do-wells to the roués of the gaming table, from famous womanizers, actors and actresses, from the posh party to cavorting with prostitutes, from high life to low life.
People like Sir John Lade, whose wife Letty had been married to a highwayman who perished on the gallows. And then he was friends with the Barrymores, who were known as Cripplegate, Hellgate, and the sister was known as Billingsgate because of her disgusting language.
He runs through the whole gamut of what rich young men do at the time. It's horse racing, it's gambling all night, it's spending money on clothes. It's a quintessential spoilt rich kid life.
George spent a huge amount on fashion. His carriages were the kind of latest in technology and the latest in speed. His parties and the great rooms in which he gave his parties at Carlton House were great themed extravaganzas.
He seemed to revel in flaunting his extravagance, and it meant that he had to keep reapplying to Parliament for larger and larger alliances, which was not popular at all.
Already by 1784, George is massively in debt, and he's only, 22 then, and he's only just come of age, being able to spend his own money for a year. Already, looking at in sort of modern terms, he's about 16, 17, 18 million pounds in debt. These were debts on a continental scale, and of course, continental monarchies were absolutist institutions which could pillage the country at will. Here we are in a constitutional monarchy with ultimately the taxpayer being asked to bail out the heir to the throne. George is someone born out of time and perhaps in the wrong country. It's something I think that would be more appropriate in Louis XIV's France. His personal treasurer, Colonel Hotham, is actually writing to him in a very explicit way, in a way perhaps that even modern courtiers would not dare to do, laying out just where all his money's going and boldly saying, look, you're spending far too much money. It's a marvellous litany of expenditure that Hotham drags up.
Your Royal Highness knows well the whole of your income. £12,500 which you receive from the government each quarter. Add to that the precarious supply of your Duchy of Cornwall, and that is all you have. How inadequate these two streams are to furnish so many torrents of expense your Royal Highness can judge. Your debts rise by the hour, sir.
Statement of arrears due to sundry persons under the several departments of His Royal Highness, Prince of Wales. His Royal Highness's private debts, £8,000. Arrears in the department of the Privy Purse, £46,000, 2 shillings and 6pence halfpenny. Ditto Comptroller of the Household, £12,800, 14 shillings and 11pence. Ditto Mr. Wells, Lady Privy Purse, £5,601, 2 shillings and a halfpenny. And a halfpenny, and a halfpenny, and a halfpenny. Mr. Jeffreys the jeweller, £1,203. Mr. Gordon the lacemaker, £2,180. Newcomb the bootmaker, White the breeches maker, Egg the gunmaker, shoemaker, watchmaker, coachmaker, bookseller, saddler, hatter, shoemaker, watchmaker, confectioner,
catcher, saddler, embroiderer, saddler, stilly. Debts. The total, sir, to Lady Day is £269,878, 6 shillings and 7 farthing.
It is a large sum, I confess.
Sir, you are at the mercy of your builder, your upholsterer, your jeweller, and your tailor. You must take measures. You must retrench.
Surely you would not have the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent to the crown of Great Britain, dismiss his servants, sell his horses, part with every magnificence annexed to his situation in life? A moment's reflection will, I'm sure, convince you of the absurdity, as well as the impossibility, of adopting so ridiculous as well as indecent a measure. It would be improper for me to live with a less degree of magnificence than I hitherto have done.
The thing that dominates and distorts George's life is the madness of his father, George III. George is often the focus of a lot of the rages that come with his father's madness, and that level of fury directed at you personally must have been very, very frightening for George.
The king's madness was enormously embarrassing to George. The father starts talking at an incredibly promiscuous rate, becoming obscene, chasing women around the palace, using a kind of language which was like his sort of innermost buried self coming out and being uttered. The father becoming this mad sexual being all of a sudden.
And this is always the thought at the back of his mind, that he could end up like his father. It's almost a horror movie.
George III's madness and the definition of his madness becomes the pivotal political issue. If the doctors say he has gone mad, it raised the very real and very immediate prospect that this young Prince of Wales was going to get his hands on power, that he was going to be the regent, that he could therefore pay off his own debts, that he could put his friends into office, and that he could get out from under his father.
For George and his father, the personal and political are always tangled up. Very, very early on, right from when he's just a boy, George discovered that taking up with his father's political enemies was the great way to get back at him.
Wilkes and liberty!
Wilkes and liberty.
Wilkes being a rabble-rousing and radical Democrat who'd once attacked the king in a deeply personal and insulting way. When he comes of age, George takes this political infighting with his father even further. He actually becomes a Foxite, that's a supporter of Charles James Fox, the leader of the Whig Party, which was opposed to the Tory ministers that had been appointed by his father. If there was one man in parliamentary politics who George III loathed with a deep passion, it was Charles James Fox. He didn't just support Fox, he virtually lived with him for quite a lot of the time. They went to each other's parties, they went to gambling clubs together, they shared a mistress at one point. George III always believed that Fox had morally debauched his son.
George seems to have no real conception that the people to whom he has become very close are Democrats, are people who are actually not particularly wedded to the cause of the monarchy or the royal family. Perhaps the great Whig motion of the 1780s was a motion in Parliament which summed it up from their perspective, which was that the motion said the power of the king has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished.
I do hope he is not such a fool as not to know that his interests are inseparable from mine.
For the radical Whigs, George, the Prince of Wales, is a very ambivalent figure. On the one side, of course, he is the embodiment of the hereditary principle, which politically they oppose. On the other side, there's a fantastic opportunity because he's the future of the monarchy who might be used by them to lever themselves back into power. While at first this seems like a fairly distant and abstract prospect, as George III becomes a more and more unstable figure, you suddenly have the prospect that this young Prince of Wales will come into power.
In a situation where a regency had to be created, there were two ways to do it. One was to do it on the basis of parliamentary power, for which there were precedents. The other way was simply to declare that because the king had lost his reason, then the heir to the throne would take over all the powers of the crown, regardless of Parliament. Now, it was plainly in the interests of William Pitt, who was Prime Minister at the time, that the first route should be taken, and Charles James Fox and the Whigs the second route, because that would give them complete power through the future king or the future regent.
His Majesty is unwell, Fox.
And yet there is in the kingdom an heir apparent of full age and capacity to exercise and restore the royal power, to exercise the royal authority.
I tremble at the thought of doing anything which may in the smallest degree endanger the agitating of His Majesty's mind. There is no one, both in heart and mind, who can be truly or more sincerely devoted and attached to his sacred person than myself.
Just so, Your Highness. But now that the true state of the king's health is clear, there is not a single moment to be lost. The Prince of Wales has as clear a right to exercise the power of sovereignty during the period of illness and incapacity, just as if His Majesty had undergone a natural and perfect demise.
These were the people who had been arguing systematically, and at times almost libelously, against the way George III exercised his powers and against the principle of the royal prerogative. And suddenly they changed just like that.
They have to start asserting things in Parliament which go against their whole philosophical and political tradition. I mean, they know that makes them look ridiculous. But from their point of view, the game is worth the candle.
You to whisper to me, sir!
The plots and political manoeuvring last from the end of November 1788 to March the following year. And then, quite unexpectedly, the king suddenly recovers. This is the worst possible news for George.
For the whole thing to have worked, George actually needed to get power. But when the king recovers, George is left in a completely exposed situation. He's left looking like this cynical, heartless, cold figure who exulted in his father's distress and illness and tried to use this terrible national crisis to get himself into a position of power so that he could pay off his own debts.
He does terribly badly out of that because the Queen and the family immediately tell the king how badly they think that his eldest son has behaved, and that poisons relationships between the two of them for the next 20 years, really.
My dear son, on Saturday next there will be a concert of music to celebrate His Majesty's recovery. It is only intended for those who have supported us through the late business, and therefore you may possibly not choose to be present.
Your Majesty, the situation has been full of difficulty and embarrassment, and now attempts are being made to misrepresent my conduct. While we may possibly be found to have erred in judgment, to have acted on mistaken principles, I am confident that we shall not be found to have been deficient in that duteous affection to your Majesty, which nothing can or shall ever remove.
He was very unlucky in his timing. The year after the Regency crisis, the great defining event of the 18th century world occurs with the French Revolution of 1789. This is a revolution not just against the King of France, but actually against kings in general. If George III's madness had coincided with this event, the argument for a regency would have been completely irresistible. You really don't want a mad king on the throne when they're chopping the head off a perfectly sane one just across the channel. When Britain finally goes to war with revolutionary France in 1793, it's a fantastic chance for George to put the Regency crisis behind him and hopefully cover himself with military glory. George writes to his father endlessly saying, please give me a role, even if it's just that I can become an active colonel of my own regiment. Let me do something. That's the one thing that he wants to do. It's certainly what all his brothers do.
Recall, I beg you, Edward III and his son at Cressy. There, heroic Edward gave to the unexperienced Prince of Wales the command of the vanguard. And the services of the son, not on that day alone, but through life, repaid the confidence of the father. I have the good fortune to possess so many brothers that the stake of my life can be of little political importance. I beg your majesty to permit me to display the best energies of my character, to shed the last drop of my blood in support of your majesty's person, crown, and dignity.
My younger sons can have no other situation in the state but what arise from the military lines they have been placed in. You are born to a more difficult one, which I shall be most happy to find you seriously turn your thoughts to.
His father allows him to do one thing, which is to be a colonel-in-chief of one regiment. And he makes it very clear to him. He writes him a letter saying, you mustn't expect any further promotion. This is as far as it will go for you. And he makes it very clear to George that the job he has been given is a purely ceremonial one.
And it's nearest he gets to the continental battlefields, alas, is Brighton Beach.
The Prince of Wales had a life that was dominated by world-shattering events. The American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. These events threw up massive figures, people like George Washington, Admiral Nelson, Napoleon, of course, and the Duke of Wellington. And in contrast, the Prince of Wales seemed an even smaller figure than he was in real life.
One of the most intriguing things about Prince George is his capacity to see himself in terms that no one else saw him in. And he identified with very grand figures, the overwhelmingly obvious case being Napoleon. It is almost incredible that he saw himself as having any of the attributes of Napoleon. And yet he was quite capable of presenting himself as a military leader, as a political genius, as a future imperial ruler of a great British empire. All this was absolute nonsense, but it was something that went on in his head.
He does see Europe dominated by two great colossi, himself and Napoleon, and indeed sees the Napoleonic Wars as a sort of personal struggle. He takes everything personally. In fact, he represents British military victories to people like his mother as almost his own victories. He keeps saying to her, I have done my duty well. Well, actually, he's not done any duty at all. His way of fighting France is usually to hold a great big party.
Napoleon is there to get rid of literally ancien regimes, old kingdoms, old kingships. And many of these are actually George's relations. They fall like ninepins. So it would be very hard for George not to see this as a personal struggle. Where it does become crazy is where, in later years, George quite clearly believes that he actually fought in the peninsula with Wellington.
He told people that he had disguised himself as General von Bock and had led the cavalry charge at the Battle of Salamanca. It's a sad and embarrassing fact, and the rest of his courtiers just nodded and agreed.
Whatever George fantasises about Napoleon and his role in his downfall, his greatest enemy was never really Napoleon. His greatest enemy was always his wife.
George was always a ladies' man. First came Lady Jersey, then Lady Hertford, and finally, Lady Cunningham. Lady C is digging in for the duration. Not an idea in her head, not a word to say for herself. But she is determined that when the music stops, she will be left holding the parcel.
The Prince Regent liked them large, as he would put it, a cosy armful. He liked fat women, and because they didn't make him feel too fat, obviously. He liked them old as well as fat.
There's always some sense in George that he's half looking for a lover and half looking for a mother.
He was certainly a very faithless person.
Very often he liked his friends' wives. He had no sense of loyalty about that sort of thing.
I have done extravagant things, and I'm not ashamed of it. But I've always had my principles, and my principles have always been the same. Gallant to every woman, but faithful to one.
Or one at a time, at least. Allow me to introduce Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert.
My dearest, my only beloved, the wife of my heart and soul.
There was one exception, which was Maria Fitzherbert, because she was not even fat, funnily enough. And he clearly fell very much in love with Maria Fitzherbert, possibly because she was strict and she was moral herself, and she would have none of him, which is always an attractive trait to a confirmed lecturer, which he was.
I am wrapped up in you entirely. Nothing can alter me, shake me, change me. If you wish my life, you shall have it.
When he meets Maria Fitzherbert, she's already had 2 husbands. She's 6 years older than he is. He's 22, so it's actually a fair gap.
All of that might not have been quite so bad, but she was also Roman Catholic, which actually meant that, in theory, George couldn't marry her at all, even if he'd wanted to. Catholics couldn't marry heirs to the throne.
But of course, for George, at this point in his life, that's the most attractive possible thing, that you can attack your father and you can attack the Constitution at the same time, and also have a relationship with a woman to whom you are enormously attracted. But of course, the marriage couldn't be a marriage in the normal sense that you would expect a marriage from a Prince of Wales. I mean, he couldn't get married in Westminster Cathedral. If it was going to happen, it had to happen secretly.
So it's a secret marriage performed by a clergyman who George finds in a debtor's prison. And they actually lived together as man and wife in Brighton for some years, and in some ways, George later looked back on that and thought that they were some of the happiest years of his life. Maria understood him, I think, in a way that few of his later mistresses did, and actually was out to fleece him far less than some of his later mistresses.
But of course it was never going to satisfy him for too long, and she was shunted aside. One of the obvious reasons why she was shunted aside was because he wanted to get married. He didn't want to get married in any kind of sexual sense, because he felt he already was married, but he needed to get married publicly in order to construct a dynastic marriage of the old style. The only way he was going to get the king to give him a substantial increase in money and the parliaments to give him a larger annual income was through marrying. And clearly the fact that he already had a wife was a slight embarrassment.
He does it almost as a business proposition. He agrees to marry somebody pretty much of his father's choice simply to get his debts paid by Parliament. His father says, if you get married, you can have a proper establishment and we'll sort out your debts. So George agrees and sends his friend, James Harris, who's Earl of Malmesbury, off to Germany to meet the woman he's going to marry, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. When he gets there, Malmesbury's absolutely appalled by what he sees.
No, I think you get it wrong. You don't remember it the way I do, because you...
Pretty face, not expressive of softness. Figure, not graceful. Tolerable teeth, but going. Fair hair and light eyebrows. Good bust. Vastly happy with her future expectations. Talks incessantly.
I am determined never to be jealous. I know the prince is lively, but I am prepared on this point. I could be a slave to the man I love, but to him I did not love. Impossible!
No fixed character, a light and flighty mind, but meaning well and well disposed. My eternal theme to her, to think before she speaks, to recollect herself.
No, my father had a mistress. She was a very, very stupid woman, like all mistresses, I am sure. My mother was a beautiful creature, and why my father should choose to favor another, I cannot say. But then, men are stupid. This was the time.
Flippant rattling, of course. Such giddy manners cannot please the prince.
I was not the first, you know, Harris. Not only was there no appearance of blood on that first night, but her manners were not those of a novice. Ah, mon Dieu, qu'il est gros, she said, taking those liberties natural on these occasions. Now then, how should she know this without a previous means of comparison? Finding that I had suspicions of her not being new, the next night she mixed up some tooth powder and water, coloured her shift with it, and in showing these to me, at the same time showed such marks of filth, both in the fore and hind part, that she turned my stomach, and from that moment I vowed never to touch her again. It was never my wish to marry at all. I'd settled it with Frederick. He was to marry, and the crown descend to his children.
Well, well, well. Perhaps it could not be helped. In the hands of a steady, sensible man, she would certainly have turned out well. But matched with a man whose faults were perfectly analogous to her own. Well, well, well.
Their wedding night is a complete disaster. George gets drunk, arrives in Caroline's bedroom, and she says, went to sleep in the fireplace without having touched her at all. Sometime towards dawn, he finally gets his act together and stumbles into bed with her. And it's probable that at that night they do actually conceive their daughter, Princess Charlotte.
Thereafter, they only cohabit really just a few days before they separate, and they're never, ever together again.
He just finds her increasingly repulsive. I think as a result of that, he decides to himself behave towards her in a very cruel and unpleasant way.
She was an unattractive woman. She was silly. She made waxen images of him and stuck pins in them. And she was blatantly unfaithful and a slut and rather dirty. and a worst possible choice of a bride for him. But she was a sort of simple soul, and he needn't have treated her quite so badly. He could have put on a veneer of making do with the marriage. But that was probably Prince Regent's greatest mistake. He refused to dissemble at all. He considered himself above such petty things as conventions.
George is definitely cast as the villain in this marriage. In the nation as a whole, he was regarded as being a bully, somebody whose attitude to his wife was completely indefensible. He's a known philanderer by this point. He is thought to have treated her appallingly right from the very beginning. So her cause is taken up. It's a huge popular issue.
Violator of his word. A libertine. Over head and ears in debt and disgrace. A despiser of domestic ties. The companion of gamblers and demi-reps. A man without a single claim to the gratitude of his country or the respect of posterity.
George gets a really bad press and he knows he's got to fight back, so he calls on an old army crony of his, Colonel McMahon, and his job is going to be to strong-arm the press and the cartoonists. He bribes, he intimidates, and he even has editors thrown into jail for libelling George.
In consequence of certain paragraphs that have appeared, I have sent a proper person to the post to remonstrate with them. It shall not happen again.
The nation is misled, blinded, hurried away by the ferment and tide created by this worthless wretch. She is a very monster of iniquity.
The steward of the Oracle is pressing for his subsidy. These men are bloodsuckers, Your Highness. Yet, like leeches, they have their uses and must be submitted to.
You treated me neither as your wife, as the mother of your child, nor as the Princess of Wales. I no longer regard myself as subject to your orders or your rules.
She always drives me out of my senses. There's no end to her wickedness, her falsity, and her designs. There's nothing she's not capable of. Not just my humiliation, but my total destruction is aimed at. Why does the king not act against this worthless wretch?
You seem to look on your disunion with the princess as merely of a private nature, and totally put out of sight that as heir apparent, your marriage is a public act. Separation on mere disagreement of temper is repugnant to all the laws that govern us.
You would have made an excellent tailor or shoemaker or hairdresser, but nothing else. Nothing.
By around 1810, things are looking rather bleak for Prince George. He's getting on in years. His father is actually at the apogee of his popularity, and he really is hailed as the father of the nation. Meanwhile, his eldest son is constantly involved in unseemly battles with his wife. At the end of 1810, however, things start to change.
George III suffers his third bout of madness, and it's quite clear that he's never going to come out of it. And at this point, finally, George gets what he's been hoping for since the 1780s, and he is finally made Prince Regent.
A new era is now arrived.
I have no predilections to indulge, no resentments to gratify, no objects to attain but such as are common to the whole empire.
The principal physical achievement of the Regency is the Brighton Pavilion, which, during the Regency years, George has John Nash completely reconfigure in this bizarre Hindu-Chinese hybrid style.
Brighton Pavilion is a pleasure palace masquerading as a home, one that's made for gaiety of life, not for sort of everyday living. And it looks thoroughly and utterly and completely foreign in a fabulous Far Eastern way. He was a consumer, but quite a bloody well informed consumer, because he did go and find the pretty good architects, and if they weren't good enough, he sacked them and got another better one. On the Brighton Pavilion, you got Nash. Nash was a flamboyant architect. He designed buildings that could be thought of as something like the sort of Chevrolet Impala of architecture. Lots of fins, lots of frou-frou and fun and gaiety to them. The Regency period wasn't just one of excess and scandal. It was a period of change, because it was a period when everything was being invented for the Industrial Revolution, but the sort of heaviness of the Industrial Revolution hadn't taken over. So there was great freedom, fabulous freedom of thought and ideas, and somehow the world seemed to be our oyster instead of our master. And if one doesn't look into his life too carefully, if you look at him lightly, as it were, at a distance through slightly rose-tinted spectacles, then he could be set up as a figurehead. He expressed the pleasures of his time.
The Regency does represent a tremendous turning point in British history, but there is no evidence whatever that Prince George really had any sense of the kind of society that was emerging. And one really has to go back to the big picture to see how badly adrift he is in that respect. The Industrial Revolution, it's transforming individuals' lives, it's transforming communities, it's transforming whole regions. There was also a feeling of moral change that was going on in the early 19th century. Things like the abolition of slave trade and the abolition of slavery, Sunday schools, educational reforms, poor law reform. Do we have any evidence that Prince George had the remotest understanding of all that or took any real interest in it? None whatever. Instead, he turns to Brighton and to his fascination with uniforms and all the other things that are going on at this time.
Brighton Pavilion becomes the ultimate symbol of George IV. It's fun, it's colourful, it's extravagant, it's certainly hugely expensive, and it's a complete dead end. It's an irrelevance to Britain. It's just a symbol of George as a slightly opium-raddled old mandarin residing in the middle of this fun palace which has nothing to do with the life of his subjects or the pursuit of everyday politics.
Hush, great babe. Lie still and slumber. Troops of lancers guard thy bed. Chinese gimcracks without number nicely dangle o'erhead. Whether viewed in robes of state or glittering in a fancy dress, wisdom cannot make you greater, folly cannot make you less. Thus you'll pass your time securely, and your baubles all retain. I shall aspirate demurely. Heavens, what a glorious reign.
came up smartly from the woods where we had lay hidden for much of the morning. At that moment, seeing that all was at hazard, I rose in my stirrups and cried, "Come on, lads!" And so we galloped down the slope of the sunken road, pell-mell. We mounted the ridge. The smoke was thick, but then, by God, it cleared, and we beheld before us the standards of the old guard.
George III dies in 1820, and so George finally becomes king after being regent for nearly 10 years. For somebody who has been obsessed all his life with the imagery of kingship, with striking the right kind of figure, George was simply not at all the sort of figure that he must have hoped he would be when he finally inherited the crown.
He had been the king in waiting for so long that when it came, he was already a not particularly healthy and somewhat debilitated man.
He doesn't breathe very well, he's fantastically overweight, he can't move properly, he hasn't sat on a horse for years. Most of his rooms are now on the ground floor of buildings because he can't walk upstairs. He spends most of his time in bed.
He becomes even more self-absorbed in his last years, an even more pathetic character. And of course, although he's still interested in presenting himself, the effort of doing so becomes more and more difficult. So this is all about the sort of implosion of a personality that had always been actually quite brittle. It's one of the great sadnesses of the last years of George IV's life that the politicians came to regard him with complete contempt. They saw him as someone who needed manipulating. One had to take some note of what he said. But at the end of the day, they knew that he would do what he had to do in their view.
The politician who dominates George's final years is the Duke of Wellington, who becomes his Prime Minister in 1828. George admires Wellington almost to the point of hero worshipping him, but the feeling was never mutual.
As a reactionary Tory, Wellington was an absolute believer in the monarchy, in the crown, but he was never under any illusions about the character and the personality of George IV.
The king is a blockhead, and nobody much minds what he says anymore. He likes to talk grandly to make people imagine that his prime minister is a sort of maître d'hôtel, which he might dismiss any moment that it happened to suit him. But this is mere meaningless bravado.
My lord?
Your Majesty.
Wellington didn't have much respect for the king and was able to manipulate him. And he did this partly by indulging his fantasies and partly by standing up to him.
At that moment, seeing all was at hazard, I rose in my stirrups and cried, "Come on, lads." And so we galloped down the slope of the sunken road, pell-mell.
Very steep, I should imagine, sir.
Quite so. Quite so. We mounted the ridge, the smoke was thick, but then, my God, it cleared, and we beheld before us the standards of the old guard. Is this not so, my lord?
I have often heard your Majesty say so.
The king had what I suppose in modern day you'd call a hissy fit occasionally about his ministers, and Wellington would look him in the eye and effectively ask him to be sacked.
We have an abominable constitution. I would rather be a shoeblack than a member of that odious parliament. But if I were a private person, I should enter it solely with the aim of telling the truth. None of my ministers tell it.
If you do not like your ministers and what they are proposing, you would much better turn them out at once and be done with it. Sir.
Indeed. Well, perhaps I shall. I can do it. Why should I not do it?
Your Majesty, there are many things which you can do, but that you ought not to do.
In George's last years, he sort of sheds all the brilliance he'd had earlier in life. His mind is wandering, he's becoming genuinely ill, possibly genuinely senile. He's becoming more and more reliant on the consumption of laudanum, on the consumption of alcohol. He's completely rather losing the plot.
Every year that goes by in the 1820s, he withdraws further and further into a world where it's quite clear he doesn't want to see new people. He says, "New faces disturb me. I don't like seeing new people." He retreats into Windsor Great Park and has a lodge built for himself there, with special roads constructed that only he can ride on, so nobody can actually encounter him. So all his great ambitions for being this extraordinary new vision of kingship actually, when he is king, shrink into a narrow world which is basically populated by a succession of older, rather matronly mistresses and few trusted servants who surround him.
When he becomes king, the big issues that he seems to regard as crucial are, yet again, the purely personal ones. So getting rid of his disastrous queen is very high on the list.
A very monster of iniquity.
By this point, Caroline's been living abroad for about 5 years. She's lived mainly in Italy, and she's taken up with somebody called Baron Pergami. He's tall, he's very good looking, he's Italian, and he's got luxuriant whiskers and a very, very fake pedigree.
Caroline was actually offered a bounty never to return to England, which she refused to take. Because as soon as George succeeded to the throne on the death of his father, she set sail for England, and thus began the great saga of the trial of Queen Caroline.
When what is effectively the trial of the Queen begins, it's quite clear that the Prince has been collecting evidence against her for years and years and years. He had spies sent out to Milan, where they set up a kind of government office, really, in order to take evidence from serving maids, housemaids, trying to establish whether or not Pergami and Caroline slept together regularly. There was nothing that they flinched from.
How many beds were there in the princess's bedroom?
2.
Question. How many beds were there in the princess's bedroom? Answer. 2. Question. Did you make any observation on the beds in the bedroom of the princess, whether they had both been slept in or only one?
Erano molto stropicciati.
They were both tumbled. In the making up of the beds, did you observe anything upon the sheets or any part of the bed?
Era macchiato.
There were stains on the sheets. What sort of stains?
Bianche.
The evidence of every kind of servant and household member. They put them into government green bags, which were then presented to the House of Lords and were known and endlessly caricatured in cartoons as the green bags full of evidence. The smoking gun, really, by which the king was hoping to get rid of his wife.
There was no way of getting rid of his wife without going through Parliament. And once you went through Parliament, then you were into this media show and into a very big public reaction. He was creating, unintentionally, a grand theatrical effect, of exactly the sort that he wouldn't have wanted. It was an absolute sensation.
The trial of Queen Caroline wasn't exactly a trial. It was a debate in the House of Lords on an ancient bill of the pains and penalties, something that George and his ministers had discovered in the annals of British history. And fundamentally, what it would do if Caroline was convicted, found guilty, was it would refuse to allow her to take up her title, and then the divorce would be the next stage.
I don't think many people were necessarily very attracted by his queen either, but by persecuting her, he made her a much more interesting and important figure. And also it conflicted with his image, the image he wanted to project. The first gentleman of Europe divorces his wife, the Queen of England, in this rather despicable and squalid way. It's not the way kings should behave. So it's a big political error, and it doesn't work anyway.
The bill was dropped. And the bill was dropped not so much because there wasn't enough evidence to convict the poor woman, but the dichotomy, the one rule for him, George, and the one rule for her was coming to a head, and there was a real fear that there would be a popular revolt because Caroline was taken to be the champion of the people, and she was acquitted.
George is furious but decides to have his coronation anyway. Caroline is definitely not on the guest list, but she turns up, as you'd expect of her, demanding to be crowned alongside him. And in a scene that, if you wrote it, no one would ever believe, the Queen of England gets physically turned away from the doors of Westminster Abbey by George's bouncers. 2 weeks after all this, she's dead, probably of stomach cancer.
Sire, your greatest enemy is dead.
Oh, is she, by God? The blessing which the protecting hand of God in his mercy has bestowed upon me in this recent event is so great I even yet can hardly bring myself to believe that it is really so. It has literally turned one almost quite topsy-turvy. I trust that it affords me a fair prospect of real and true happiness for the rest of my days.
Once Caroline's dead, George has the sense that everything can get better now, that the nightmare of his marriage, which has gone on since 1796, can now be over and that he can start again. Now he will be able to do everything that he's always planned to do. In practice, it doesn't really turn out like that, and I think that's largely due to his physical deterioration.
My boy, this is death.
Wellington is appointed George's executor, and one of his final jobs is to sort through the king's private papers and dispose of anything that might cause embarrassment to his heirs. What he discovers, though, really sums up just how pointless and empty and finally how wasted George's life really was.
He had never given away or parted with anything. There was a prodigious quantity of hair, women's hair, of all colours and lengths. Women's gloves, which he had got at balls, and with the perspiration still marked on the fingers. Volumes of love letters, trinkets of all sorts. Dirty, snuffy pocket handkerchiefs with old faded nosegays tied up in them. In short, such a collection of trash as I had never seen before. I thought the best thing would be to burn them all.